What if the one person standing between your company and total financial collapse was the same person you fired at 7:45 in the morning, in front of everyone, without letting him speak a single, complete sentence? Stay with me, because what happened next inside one of America's largest payment processing firms is something no business school case study will ever prepare you for. The moment Maya Hartwell officially became CEO of Vertex Pay, she decided to do something most executives never bother with on day one. She walked the floor herself. No assistants, no prepared presentations, no curated tours. She wanted to see the company raw, exactly as it existed when no one was performing for her. Vertex Pay was not a company where optics were a minor concern. It was a financial technology powerhouse, one of the largest in the country, processing billions in corporate wire transfers, authenticating high-speed payment instructions, and managing transaction pipelines for thousands of enterprise clients across every time zone in the continental United States. The system never slept. A serious disruption, even a brief one, carried the potential for losses measured in tens of millions of dollars and reputational damage that could take years to undo. Maya understood this in the abstract. She had studied the company. She had read the reports. What she had not yet developed was a feel for the specific texture of the thing, the living organism beneath the org chart. She moved through the operations center with that intent, to observe, to absorb, to form her own picture without filters. Then she stopped. At the primary workstation, the nerve center of the entire technical floor, a man was asleep at his desk. His head rested on his folded arms. Around him, 24 monitors blazed with scrolling data, amber indicators, and status alerts that pulsed with quiet urgency. The room was cold and bright. Everyone else was moving. He was completely still. Maya did not approach him calmly. She did not ask a colleague for context. She did not read the screens surrounding him. She looked at the badge clipped to the edge of his workstation, read the name printed on it, and spoke it aloud into the room. Ethan Cross jolted upright. His eyes were dry and unfocused, his body lagging several seconds behind his mind as it scrambled for orientation. He had not chosen to stop. He had simply run out of fuel. He recognized Maya from the company-wide announcement posted the previous week. He understood immediately what was happening. He opened his mouth. She cut him off before a single word of substance could leave it. This company does not compensate people to sleep at their stations. Security, badge. HR, begin the termination process immediately. Ethan looked at her. Not with desperation, not with anger, with the specific, grinding urgency of someone watching a preventable disaster arrive in slow motion and being physically unable to stop it. The payment cluster, he said. You need to hear what I know about the... I don't need to hear anything on my first morning. The operations floor went silent. Engineers who had watched Ethan work without stopping for nearly 2 full days said nothing. The social calculus of speaking against a new CEO in her opening hour was one none of them could solve fast enough. Ethan removed his badge slowly. He placed it on the desk without argument. Before he walked out, he turned to a junior engineer named Marcus, standing a few feet away, and said 4 words clearly enough for several people nearby to catch them. Don't restart it. Ever. A few people assumed it was bitterness, a parting shot from a man who felt wronged. Maya registered it as nothing meaningful at all. She had already categorized the morning as a necessary act of leadership. The first clean signal that comfortable negligence was finished. To understand what Maya had just done, you need to understand who Ethan Cross actually was. His title was Senior Systems Engineer. His title communicated almost nothing about his function. Ethan was 36 years old, quiet in the way that people become when they stop needing to announce themselves to be taken seriously. He wore the faint darkness of chronic undersleep like a permanent condition. New employees generally assumed he was solid but unremarkable, a dependable technician with a slightly rumpled appearance and a habit of abandoning half-finished coffee cups near his keyboard. People who had worked beside him for years held an entirely different understanding. Ethan knew Vertex Pay's infrastructure the way a physician knows a patient they have operated on repeatedly over many years. Not just the textbook anatomy, but the individual quirks, the scar tissue, the workarounds that had been layered in across transitions that were never properly completed. He understood authentication relay logic that predated 2 different CTO tenures. He understood the failover architecture that 3 successive leadership teams had promised to modernize and never had. He understood the fragile interdependencies built by engineers who had long since left the company, solving problems that no longer existed, but whose removal would create something worse. He was the institutional memory the company had never formally documented. Outside Vertex Pay, Ethan was the sole parent of a 9-year-old daughter named Sophie. His wife had died 3 years earlier after a long illness. In the years since, he had organized his life around 2 fixed coordinates, keeping Sophie cared for and keeping his professional position stable enough that she never felt the absence of anything she needed. He did not cultivate allies inside the company. He did not perform the social rituals that convert colleagues into advocates. He arrived. He worked. He went home. That was the shape of his life, and he had made a particular kind of peace with it. On the other side of that equation stood Maya Hartwell, 31 years old, newly appointed as CEO following her uncle's retirement from the board due to health concerns. Maya was legitimately accomplished. Her track record in corporate restructuring and growth strategy had been earned in rooms where people expected her to fail, often because of her age, more often because of her last name. She had proven them wrong, repeatedly, and the proving had shaped her. She was decisive. She despised visible indiscipline. She arrived at Vertex Pay carrying enormous pressure to demonstrate that she was not simply a family appointment, and that pressure sharpened every instinct she brought through the door. In her first week, she announced an operational audit, a tightening of performance standards, and what she described as a fundamental cultural reset, moving the organization from comfortable to accountable. Beneath the surface of that agenda, in the aging infrastructure Maya had not yet had time to fully examine, something had already begun to break. 3 days before the morning that changed everything, Ethan noticed something in the transaction authentication logs. It was subtle at first, a pattern of irregular requests appearing in the international processing queue at low frequency, constructed to mimic legitimate internal traffic closely enough that every automated monitoring filter had ignored them completely. But Ethan saw it. The rhythm was wrong in a way he could not immediately articulate, but absolutely could not dismiss. These were not the signs of someone attempting to overwhelm the system or generate visible errors. This was something more patient and more sophisticated. Someone was studying it. He traced the intrusion backward through the log history. A secondary authentication relay, a low-priority component handling a narrow subset of international payment verifications, had been quietly compromised. From that entry point, the intruder had been methodically probing deeper layers, mapping what the relay could access, building a pathway toward the core infrastructure. The objective was not immediate destruction. It was infiltration followed by a precise, high-value strike during a peak processing window, redirecting funds, collapsing reconciliation mechanisms, or both. Ethan escalated to his direct manager. His manager, acutely aware that a major incident report surfacing the day before a new CEO arrived would be received poorly, asked Ethan to keep monitoring the situation and avoid generating alarm before anything had been definitively confirmed. The message, politely delivered, was a request to stay quiet and hope. Ethan did not comply in any meaningful sense. He began building temporary isolation structures around every segment he had identified as potentially compromised. He constructed manual traffic redirect layers that absorbed suspicious requests without generating visible failures. He hot-patched individual nodes across the architecture with the precision of someone shoring up a structure that cannot be taken offline without collapsing it entirely. The fundamental difficulty was that the infrastructure was ancient, accumulated across years of partial upgrades, emergency fixes, and improvised solutions, and there was no safe method to bring it down for a proper clean. Defending it, while keeping it fully operational simultaneously, meant working without a safety net on a live system with zero margin for meaningful error. What followed was the kind of sustained endurance that most people will never experience. Ethan barely left the floor. He consumed vending machine food between monitoring intervals. He changed his shirt once in the technical staff restroom, sometime after midnight. The engineers around him saw his presence as they would see a familiar piece of furniture, noting it without registering significance. Nobody understood the scale of what he was actually doing. He was not troubleshooting a bug. He was keeping an entire financial system alive through sheer force of accumulated knowledge and absolute refusal to stop. Late in the second night, he discovered something that changed the situation from serious to catastrophic. The attackers had embedded a delayed activation mechanism inside the primary processing cluster, a dormant trigger, invisible during normal operations, designed to fire automatically the moment anyone performed a standard system restart. A restart was routine maintenance. Engineers used it regularly to clear memory accumulation and resynchronize services. Anyone encountering a slowdown would reach for it instinctively. If that happened, every temporary defensive structure Ethan had built would vanish with the cleared memory state. The dormant pathway would open. The attack would move from preparation to active execution. Ethan documented everything. A complete file of time-stamped log summaries, technical notes, patch annotations, and explicit warnings, assembled with the compressed urgency of someone working under sustained pressure without time to format anything for a general audience. At the bottom of the final page, in slightly larger text than the rest, he wrote a single line. "If I am not available, do not restart core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack awaiting a trigger. Call me first." He included his personal cell number. His intention was to deliver the file directly to executive leadership when the morning shift arrived, but the body eventually overrides intention when pushed past every reasonable limit. Sitting in front of the running display, waiting for the day team, he put his head down for a single moment. He did not come back up. After Ethan left the building, the operations floor continued functioning. From the surface, it looked manageable. The isolation structures he had installed were quietly absorbing irregular traffic, maintaining stability across the most sensitive processes in ways that were completely invisible unless you understood what you were looking at. To Maya and the supervisors joining her morning briefings, a system running normally in Ethan's absence seemed to validate the morning's decision. If nothing had broken, there had never been anything urgent to begin with. She moved through her scheduled sessions with focused precision, outlining performance expectations, describing cultural transformation, mapping the structural changes she intended to implement. Some people left those meetings energized. Others left with a formless unease they could not name. Nobody in those rooms had a clear enough picture of what Ethan had been doing to know how to interrupt her. Inside the technical department, the atmosphere was different. A handful of engineers who had worked alongside Ethan for years were quietly furious and equally powerless. Some of them had already opened the repository folder where he stored working notes, reading the dense technical shorthand of someone who had written at speed, without the ability to format anything for outside eyes. The warnings were visible even in partial comprehension, but comprehension and action are different things, and nobody possessed enough of the former to produce the latter. Shortly before noon, a processing cluster began showing elevated latency. Transactions queued for several seconds where fractions of a second had previously been the standard. The on-duty supervisor recognized a familiar pattern. He reached for the standard solution. Marcus hesitated. "He told us not to restart it," he said, quietly enough that the words nearly dissolved into background noise. The supervisor's expression shifted with the specific impatience of someone who has already moved past a consideration. "He doesn't work here." In the practical logic of institutional hierarchy, a terminated employee's final warning carries approximately the weight of a stranger's opinion. The restart command executed at 12:47 p.m. In the first minutes after the restart, there was a misleading improvement. Queue times dropped. Congestion patterns smoothed.
The supervisor exhaled with the satisfaction of someone whose instinct had been validated. Then the authentication tokens went asynchronous. It happened in cascading waves. The first indicator was a cluster of transaction sessions reporting unexpected state mismatches, payments displaying as uninitialized as if they had never been submitted. The token synchronization service had lost its connection to the primary routing pathway the instant the restart cleared the memory state, where Ethan's temporary defensive logic had been quietly running. The isolation structures collapsed. The dormant trigger fired. What followed was quiet in the way that only genuinely serious technical failures can be quiet. Methodical, technical, and deeply frightening to anyone who understood the numbers appearing on screen. Outbound transaction routing began redirecting a subset of traffic toward endpoints outside Vertex Pay's verified network. Reconciliation for a category of corporate transfers failed silently. Several high-value payment instructions entered a suspended state that was neither completed nor cleanly reversible. The monitoring systems, stripped of the bridging logic Ethan had constructed, could not accurately distinguish between internal processing errors and deliberate external manipulation. Engineers worked at an impressive pace. Their impressive pace was not enough. Rollbacks were attempted. The rollbacks failed to anchor correctly because the system state they targeted had never been formally documented. It had been a functional construction assembled live, under sustained pressure by a single person who was no longer in the building. Node isolation was attempted. The interdependencies that Ethan understood intuitively were not mapped anywhere accessible to anyone else. Someone pulled up his repository file and began reading the technical notes aloud to the group gathered around the primary console. The notes described the active failure mode with remarkable precision. Understanding them fully enough to reverse what was happening was an entirely different problem. Enterprise client calls were already coming in. Maya was called down from the executive floor. She walked into the operations center for the second time that day and found a room that had been transformed. The monitors were overwhelmingly red. Engineers moved between stations with the compressed urgency of people who know exactly how serious a situation is and are afraid to say it plainly. She asked what was happening. A senior engineer turned from his console, face pale with the composure of someone who has decided to say the true thing. It looks like he was holding the entire system together by hand for 2 days. We just deactivated everything he built. The engineer did not use Ethan's name. Everyone in the room knew. Maya asked whether they could fix it. She asked who understood the patch logic. She asked about the CTO's working knowledge of the legacy architecture. The answers she received did not comfort her. The company was bleeding. The only person who fully understood its circulatory system had been walked out of the building 6 hours earlier. Maya read Ethan's complete file at an empty workstation. At the bottom of the final page, in slightly larger text, was the line he had written last. The warning, the phone number, the instruction that had been sitting in the repository the entire time. Nobody had called it. She called 3 times. The phone rang without answer. His body, she understood with uncomfortable clarity, might genuinely be unable to hear it. She requested his home address from HR. She picked up her keys, walked to the parking structure, and drove herself. The neighborhood was quiet and ordinary. Older construction, a place where people actually lived rather than performed the idea of living. Maya stood briefly outside her car, registering the distance between where she had spent the last several hours and where she was standing now. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again with more force. The door opened and a child appeared in the space it revealed. Small, with slightly disordered hair and a worn stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. She looked up at Maya with the calm, evaluating gaze of a child who has learned to read adult visitors quickly and carefully. "Are you here to see my dad?" Maya had not known there was a child. It had never entered any professional context in which Ethan existed because Ethan did not use his personal life as a credential. Sophie opened the door wider when she determined the woman outside was not a threat. Inside the apartment, Ethan was lying on the sofa in the same clothes he had worn to work that morning. His jacket was still on. One shoe had been removed. The other remained on his foot. A glass of water he had poured and apparently forgotten sat untouched on the low table beside him. Empty takeout containers on the kitchen counter marked the meals of someone eating without attention across multiple consecutive days. He had the absolute stillness of someone who had not chosen to stop, but had simply run out of anything left to give. Sophie lowered her voice in the instinctive way children do when the sleep nearby is genuinely necessary. Daddy hasn't really slept. He said something very bad was happening at work. He promised he would rest after he fixed it. The words were simple and factual. They landed in Maya's chest like something physical. She looked at the apartment, the careful economy of it, the evidence of a life organized around necessity and love, and thought about every assumption she had carried into the operations center that morning. The image she had constructed in 10 seconds, the certainty she had felt, the complete and total wrongness of it. It took several attempts to wake him. Ethan surfaced in stages. The way people do when the debt their body has accumulated is genuinely severe. When he recognized Maya standing in his living room, his first expression was not anger. It was not bitterness. It was the specific exhaustion of a person being handed one more demand they did not ask for. He sat up slowly and said nothing. Maya did not arrange her words. She did not build toward anything. I didn't listen to you this morning. I removed you before I understood what was happening. I owe you an apology for that. Ethan looked at her without responding. He was not withholding anything strategically. He was simply not yet in a place where words changed what he was feeling. She continued because the situation did not allow her to wait. They restarted the system. It's failing. Nobody in that building understands your patch architecture well enough to stop it. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Not surprise. Just the particular weight of being right about something you had genuinely hoped not to be right about. He reached for the laptop lying open beside him and pulled up the remote monitoring interface. He scanned the metrics for less than a minute, then set the laptop down. The numbers confirmed what Maya's face had already communicated. He did not stand immediately. He looked at Sophie first. He asked whether she had eaten, whether she had finished her schoolwork, whether Mrs. Navarro from across the hall had confirmed she was coming over. Sophie answered each question with the composed patience of a child who understands that her father is being asked to go back to something difficult and has decided not to make it harder. She said yes to all three. Something passed between them that required no words at all. Then he looked at Maya. I'm going back because if that breach completes, real people, customers, businesses, workers whose livelihoods depend on those payment systems, will absorb consequences that belong to this organization. That is the reason. Not the apology, not the position. He stood, changed his shirt, said something quiet to Sophie, picked up his laptop and jacket and walked to the door. He looked back at his daughter once. Sophie waved with the rabbit's paw. Ethan almost smiled. Then they drove back to headquarters in silence. When Ethan walked back into the operations center, the room changed. Not with applause. Not with visible relief. With something closer to the specific exhale of a group of people who have been managing a problem beyond their capacity and have just seen the one person with the relevant capacity come back through the door. He did not acknowledge it. He moved directly to the primary console, took the seat someone vacated without being asked, and began a rapid assessment of current system state. He asked for full log access, current architecture snapshots, and a verbal summary of every intervention the team had attempted since the restart. He listened without interrupting. When the summary concluded, he was quiet for approximately 8 seconds. Then he began distributing the work. 5 engineers were directed to isolate the anomalous outbound connections and redirect them into a controlled observation environment rather than blocking them blindly. Blocking too early would signal detection to the attackers and trigger defensive countermeasures on their end. 2 engineers were assigned to trace exactly where redirected transaction data was being routed. A 3rd group was tasked with preparing a controlled failover for the highest value processing queue. Someone from legal was asked to contact the three largest enterprise clients with a carefully worded acknowledgement of a temporary technical issue, language calibrated to avoid triggering contractual escalation clauses. One person was given a single assignment: record every command Ethan issued in order. The distribution of the work was its own kind of demonstration. This was not performance. This was someone executing a plan he had been developing mentally across 48 hours, adapting it in real time to a situation that had deteriorated further than he had hoped. He understood the system not just as it had been designed to function, but as it had evolved into something different from its original design, and what that evolution meant when the system was placed under the precise kind of stress currently being applied to it. Over the following 90 minutes, the hemorrhage slowed. The anomalous routing pathway was severed from its connection to the core payment layer. 3 suspended high-value transactions were isolated and quarantined before any funds transferred outside verified networks. The intrusion access point was identified and neutralized through 17 specific changes to the authentication configuration, each one closing a door the attackers had constructed, removing the mechanism that would have allowed re-entry. There were losses. Several smaller transaction batches would require manual reconciliation. 2 enterprise clients would receive formal incident notifications. The security audit that followed would be extensive and expensive. But the catastrophic outcome, a large-scale diversion of corporate funds followed by mandatory public disclosure of a security failure at that magnitude, had been averted. When Ethan confirmed that the authentication layer had restabilized and the intrusion pathway was permanently closed, the room released a collective breath that was almost audible. The emergency review convened within the hour. Department heads, the CTO, and the board's technical liaison gathered in the main conference room. The full incident timeline was presented. Ethan had detected the intrusion 3 days before anyone else. He had reported it through proper channels and been effectively asked to be quiet. He had then worked for 48 hours to hold the infrastructure together. He had been terminated before he could brief the incoming CEO. His explicit final warning had been dismissed following his removal. The restart had been performed, and the result had been exactly what he had predicted. Around the table, people began reaching for the particular language that organizations produce when they want to distribute responsibility broadly enough that no single failure becomes too visible. Process gaps, communication breakdowns, understandable given the transition circumstances. Maya recognized the language. She had used it herself in other rooms. She understood its function, and she understood that using it now would be a direct repetition of the failure that had produced the crisis. She stood. This morning I removed Ethan Cross before I had heard a single complete sentence from him. I made that decision based on an image that confirmed what I had already decided to believe without asking a single question. I was wrong, and my error came close to costing this company something that would not have been recoverable. I am sorry to Ethan, and I am saying that in front of all of you. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when something true and costly has been said without protective language around it. Ethan, seated at the far end of the table, gave a single small nod. He did not perform forgiveness for the room. He received the apology with the quiet of someone who has set something heavy down. Not because it was resolved, but because continuing to hold it would serve no one. In the weeks that followed, the board moved to address Ethan's professional standing. There were offers of immediate promotion, substantial compensation adjustments, and a newly created role overseeing infrastructure security operations at an organizational level that would finally match the authority his expertise had always warranted. What Ethan negotiated first, and before any title or number was formalized, was a set of structural changes. He asked for a revised escalation protocol guaranteeing frontline engineers a direct path to executive leadership when reporting security concerns, a path that could not be blocked by middle management, protecting its own comfort. He asked for shift rotation standards in the operations center, making it structurally impossible for any single person to become a critical vulnerability through exhaustion. He asked for a formal policy explicitly protecting engineers who raised genuine risk alarms from any professional penalty for doing so. When he presented these requests to the board, the room was very still. Everyone present understood what they were witnessing. A man who had been handed significant institutional leverage and had chosen to spend most of it on policies that would protect the next person in his position from being destroyed the way he had nearly been destroyed. Maya accepted all three without modification. The change that mattered most was not written in any document. It was in how Maya led.
Her decisiveness remained. Her standards stayed demanding. But something in the way she moved through the organization shifted in a way that was felt before it was understood. She began arriving in departments not to inspect, but to ask questions. And she learned to ask the kinds of questions that made people feel safe enough to answer honestly. She slowed down in the moments that actually required listening. She began to distinguish, with increasing reliability, between people who spoke loudly about their work and people who were quietly holding something essential together. It was not a skill she had possessed before. It was one she had paid a significant price to acquire. Several weeks after the incident was formally closed, Maya passed through the main lobby and saw Ethan near the entrance. He was crouched slightly to adjust Sophie's backpack strap, listening to her deliver a rapid and emphatic account of something that had happened at school. His face, which Maya had memorized under pressure as controlled, precise, and almost completely unreadable, was entirely different. Open. Warm. Lit from somewhere inside in a way that professional competence does not produce. He was not a systems engineer at the end of a workday. He was a father at the end of a long week, and that was all he needed to be. Maya stood back and did not approach immediately. She had learned, at genuine cost, to recognize moments that belonged to other people. After a moment, she walked over, not as CEO, not with any agenda, and held out a small, worn, stuffed rabbit. The one she had found in her coat pocket 2 days after visiting the apartment apparently slipped in during the confusion of Ethan being woken. She had been meaning to return it. Sophie's face arranged itself into immediate delight. She took the rabbit and tucked it securely under her arm with the satisfaction of someone recovering something genuinely important. Ethan looked at Maya. There was no unresolved weight in the look. No performed warmth either. It was the look of two people who had come through something genuinely difficult from opposite sides and arrived, unexpectedly, at a version of mutual understanding that neither of them had planned for. The story ended there, in the ordinary brightness of a lobby on a late afternoon, with a child holding a rabbit and two adults standing close enough to finally see each other clearly. A man who had been publicly diminished had been publicly restored, in the same building, before many of the same people. A woman who had walked into power completely certain of her own clarity had learned the most expensive lesson of her professional life, that authority exercised without the willingness to listen is not strength. It is a specific and very costly kind of blindness. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, in the complicated quiet that follows a real crisis, once the crisis has finally passed, something fragile and genuine had begun.